Hello, friends, and welcome back to A Journey Through First John. This episode, we're going to be going through and pondering about, thinking about, conversating on First John chapter 2, verses 28, all the way up through chapter 3 to verse 10. So grab a cup of coffee or grab some kombucha, whatever you might be drinking, grab a good book, pause the video for a moment, read through it, and we're going to be touching on some highlights here. So welcome back to A Journey through First John.
All right, so one thing that we see from this passage, starting off, this passage is really going to dig into what it means to live as a child of God and what that lifestyle is like for us, what that means for us. Right away, John tells us, he says, "Dear children, remain in fellowship with Christ." And it has this tone, this very pastoral tone, this very fatherly tone that he has to these churches that he's writing to. Dear children.
Like a Papa Bear.
Papa John says, "Dear children, remain in fellowship with Christ." And he's told them, as I was in fellowship with Jesus, now you have fellowship with me. And so I'm sharing that fellowship with you, and remain in that fellowship, because that fellowship, he goes on to elaborate, that fellowship will give you courage. It will give you hope. And it won't be a fellowship that will make you feel like shrinking away or shriveling up or being nervous about what will happen when Jesus comes back. But it's this hopeful relationship of we will be abiding with him constantly, knowing that he's coming back for us. And we see he starts off chapter 3 by telling us, "Behold what manner, see how great this love is, what kind of love this is, that he calls us children." This is a love that is not seen anywhere in this world.
It's radical, man.
It's such a radical way of loving that not only were we far from God, but now we have fellowship with him, but so much more than that, he calls us his children. He calls us his sons and daughters, and we are his children. And this reminds me of the original relationship that he intended for us to have. You know, in the genealogy that Luke wrote down was the genealogy where he writes down that Adam was considered son of God. And it's that intention, that relationship that he had for each and every one of us. And so this is what Christ did for us, right? To restore that relationship for us. And it's just such a radical thing, like you mentioned, Josh. It's such a radical way of seeing it. And it's just a different culture, not like anything we see on earth. I imagine, those of us that have traveled maybe abroad or even across the country, that there's a different culture around the country, around the world. It's a different way of living. And really, the way of living as children of God is not like anything of this world.
Yeah, and
something I'm catching on before you. Something I'm catching on with that is that, like, this is such a radical thing, but it's the original thing.
Yeah.
And that was something I just caught on right now. That's awesome.
Good.
It seems like John is trying to make it pretty clear, like what you were saying, Isai, that being children of God is a beautiful restoration and recreation of the original intent of relationship. But there's also like a certain implication to it, right? And what John says, or the phrase that he kind of alludes to or uses, is that we stop practicing the way of the accuser. And instead now we're practicing the way of Jesus. Jesus was not only our savior, even though him at the cross and saving us is like one of the most beautiful things that there is ever. But he's also our teacher. He's our rabbi, which means that we follow his teachings, right? That we want to live the way that he lived his life. And if that's true, then there's going to be this sort of like thing about the way that we live that people won't understand. Like when culture is so focused on trying to make everything faster, our internet, the way that we move in transportation, the hustle, the grind. Like, why is it that Christians live in a different pace of life? Why is it that we slow down? Why is it that rather than trying to be overproductive and fill our schedules, we try to like set time aside? Maybe it's 1, 2, or 3 hours in our day to just pray and meditate and spend time with God. That seems almost counterproductive. Why is it that we live in simplicity or minimalism, as we can call it nowadays, rather than trying to keep up with the Kardashians or the Joneses or acquire more things in this materialistic world? So I think there's definitely something about living as the children of God that carries this strong implication that's different, right? It's different.
Something I'm seeing there is that the radical love of God creates radical changes in our lifestyle.
Oof, that's good. I like that. And the other thing that really stood out to me about this section is in verse 4. And I'll just read it. In verse 4, it says, everybody who sins is breaking God's law, for sin is contrary to the law of God. I think in the past, this verse has been misinterpreted to say that sin is breaking the law of God or lawlessness, as it says in Greek. But if we do look at the Greek, that's not what it's saying at all. In fact, it's saying everyone who sins also breaks God's law. It's saying that these two things are separate, but sinning leads to breaking the law, right? Not the same thing, but there's a relationship between the two. So then it leaves us with the question, then what actually is sin?
Wow, man. And to answer your question, man, I think we need to really have a good grasp of what it means, because, you know, like I can look back at my Christian walk, and there was so many times where I felt guilty. I felt, you know, filled with shame in my walk with God because I wasn't living up to the law, right?
Yeah.
But what I'm seeing here is that what sin really is it's a relationship to the rebellion. The rebellion, the original rebellion that the enemy began thousands and thousands of years ago. That's what sin really is.
Like what we said last time, right? It's this posture of rebellion to God.
Yeah, man. So it's not about down, like, because we think of sin as like downward action. So you know, we think that salvation, like, because I'm born again, right, that I gotta do all these different good things. But we need to think about our relationship. And it's so awesome that it says here in verse 8 that the Son of God came to destroy the works of the devil. So Jesus came to break down that rebellion, to restore the original relationship that we were meant to have with God. So like verse 10, and then it shifts over and it says, so now we can tell who are children of God and who are children of the devil. So we can take this verse and say like, oh man, like, you know, this guy's not righteous, or, you know, this person is, you know, and it's not telling us that we can judge people, but I think it's giving us a way of giving us confidence. And I want to explain it in this way, in the way of friendship, because we've known each other for a while, right? And there's been moments where, you know, we got mad at each other for something, you know, especially when we were all going to college together. Yeah. But that didn't mean that our relationship was broken. There must have been, you know, some act, something stupid that we must have done, but it doesn't mean that we're in wrong relationship with one another. And that's what I think this verse is saying, and what John is trying to tell us here is that if you ever feel like, you know, that you've switched sides, that, you know, just because we think that, man, one sin, like, did I lose out on salvation? But no, here's telling us, if you're not a rebellion, if you've chosen to live a life for Jesus, if you've accepted his gift, you're on his side, and nothing can get in the way. Like what Paul says in Romans, what can separate us from the love of God? What can separate us from the relationship of God? And we see this relationship. It's amazing.
Relational violations don't disqualify us from being children of God, right? I think is what you're saying too.
Yeah, for sure, man. I think people need to be reminded of the relationship with God. and how committed Jesus is to the relationship.
One of the words that stand out about how John talks about this is that he uses the word practice.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's key, because like when you practice something, you don't get it perfect. Like the more that you practice, the better you become at it. But when you're practicing something, like when you're a beginner, you're going to mess up a lot. So, but it's a process by which we continue to face towards God, to practice the way of Jesus.
Yeah. Since we're born again, right? Some of us are spiritual babies. We got to practice the crawling, the walking, the running, right? The maturity.
Yeah.
Absolutely, man.
That's good. I think also like the point that you made, Adi, whether you're a beginner or you're an expert, you're still practicing that. You're in that. Whether it's a talent or a skill, like you're honing in that skill. You don't have to be an expert to say you're developing that skill.
So let's finish off with this idea. I want to just pray this over you. If you're watching, may you continue to practice and embrace your life as a child of God. Guys, be blessed. We'll see you guys next time.